Chuck DeVore. I'm the Chief National Initiatives Officer with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and welcome to our book talk today on Christian patriotism and civic responsibility with the author, Dan Darling. And so I hope that this will be an illuminating conversation about a topic that is often significantly misrepresented, often very purposefully distorted by people on both the left and the right. And for that, I think that your book is a needed claritative of the landscape. So let's get going on this and start by asking a couple of tough questions just to start off the talk with some fun. There's a lot of talk these days about Christian nationalism, and you mentioned this in your book. I think it's one of the first things that you address, versus Christian patriotism. So, two-part question. Could you first go through perhaps what is meant by both detractors and perhaps well-meaning people when they say Christian nationalism, versus what you try to make the case for, which is a more proper biblical understanding of the role of a Christian in a nation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't really like the term nationalism because I think it's become such a pejorative against particularly conservative people of faith, conservatives who love their country, love their neighbor, and care about public policy and want to shape it. And it's sort of the latest pejorative weapon by folks who've really tried to push Christians out of the public square, and I talk about that in my book. It goes all the way back. I'm old enough to remember when George W. Bush was running for president in 2000, and he was asked in the primary, who's your favorite philosopher? And he said Jesus Christ, because he changed my life. And, the media went crazy. He's going to usher in a dangerous new theocracy. He's the new Taliban. Really, people thought this. People were saying this. And then, of course, you fast forward when Mike Johnson becomes Speaker of the House, improbably, and he talks about God's providence and God raising up leaders and taking them down, which is language that our leaders have used for all of our history. If you go back and read presidents, activists, everybody. Well, the media and the academics and all the folks are, warning about this new era of Christian nationalism, even though Mike Johnson was a religious liberty attorney who fought for the freedom of worship for everybody, So I don't like the term because I think it's used as a pejorative against the right, against Christians involved in public policy. However, there are some self-described Christian nationalists, or on the Protestant side, or Catholic integralists, who are dissatisfied with classical liberalism. They don't think the Constitution is durable enough in terms of they're somewhat scarred by modernity and all the sort of things that have happened with progressivism, and they sort of look longingly at perhaps we need an established church or a Protestant Caesar and all that kind of thing. It's a handful of folks. They're influential. They're loud. They're creating conversation. But if you really poll most American Christians, they don't want that. They like the Constitution. They just want to be involved. And so my book primarily is not against the Christian nationalists, although I do make some arguments why I don't think that's, a good model. I'm a Baptist, and we believe in a free church and a free state. We don't want the government telling people or the right and wrong ways to worship, compelling people to believe. We don't believe that's true belief. And I think the founders understood that. At the same time, the left has tried to push Christians out of the public square and shame Christians from getting involved, getting engaged, and shame Christians about loving their country. And I really wanted to primarily push back against that narrative.
So how did you become interested in this undertaking? Obviously, writing a book is not an easy thing to do. You have to order thoughts. You have to do a lot of research. What in your background led you to this path to becoming an author of such an uncontroversial topic?
Right. Well, there's a few ways to answer that. First, I've always been very patriotic, and it really goes back to even my childhood when I was like 11 years old. We lived in the Chicago area, and my parents packed up our silver Chevy station wagon and drove to Washington, D.C. I don't know how they planned a trip before the internet. Somehow people did that. And we toured the monuments. And I just remember being just so captivated by it. Particularly standing in front of the Lincoln Monument and just thinking of the enormous weight and pressure that was on him. And I've always loved both the church. I've always felt called into ministry in the church, having grown up in the church, but I've always loved politics and history and policy. I mean, I was reading National Review in high school, and which is probably why I didn't get a lot of dates, but I was reading the 3 newspapers we got, and I've always loved this. But over the last few years, having served as a pastor and then also served in the public policy side, I've just have seen the sort of the narrative that when conservative Christians get involved in public life, when they love their country, that it's always bad. People in the church hear this from well-meaning leaders saying, be careful about that. But also from the media and academics that, have, every election, there's a raft of books that are warning about the threat that conservative Christians pose to democracy. And I wanted to push back on that narrative because I don't think it's necessarily true.
So returning to perhaps the finer distinction between the phrase Christian nationalism and Christian patriotism, you talk in your book about the ways that we can biblically express love, right? With the highest love being to Christ, and then to your immediate family, right? And then to your community and your nation, and then the broader world. Could you talk a bit about the inversion of that ordered way of thinking about love that you see between the typical left-winger in America, or people perhaps who have gone astray and talk in these amorphous terms about helping the world, versus and typically then at the same time scoffing at their own neighbor if they happen to be MAGA or something, right? So unwrap that for us a bit, and how does that play into the distinction between patriotism and nationalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is really at the heart of what I was trying to do. I think a lot of times, particularly for Christians, it's presented as a binary that you either have to love God or love your country, and you always have to choose. And there are times when you have to choose, right? I think of in the book of Acts where Peter has said he can't preach the gospel. He's told by the state, and he says, well, I have to obey God rather than men, right? There are times where you have to choose between your faith and your country if you're forced to violate your conscience or something. But for the most part, it's about ordering our loves and our allegiance. It's not a binary choice. And so I've had people say, well, I can't pledge allegiance to the United States because we pledge allegiance to Christ. I said, no, if Christ is your highest allegiance, you can order your other lesser allegiances underneath that. And I'm borrowing a little bit from C.S. Lewis in his book, The Four Loves, where he talks about this, but he talks specifically about patriotism. Chesterton talked about this too. And I think they're both borrowing from Augustine, who talked about ordering these things. And it's interesting, we do this every day without thinking about it, right? So, 23 years ago, I stood at the altar and pledged allegiance to my wife, who's a Texan, by the way, from Fort Worth. And the pastor didn't say, you have to choose between loving God and loving your wife. No, if you love God as your highest allegiance, you'll actually love your wife more, and you'll love your kids more. And that's really how we do it. Now, sometimes these things can get out of order, right? So I use the example in the book of Jonah, who his love of country was ultimate. And because of that, he saw the people of Assyria, the people of Nineveh, as people that he didn't want to see transformation and change, and so that's why he resisted God's command to go there. So there's a time where you can love your patriotism can turn into sort of a disordered love, which you can call nationalism or other things. But I actually think, contrary to what you hear, church-going Christians, whether Catholic or Protestant or whatever, are the best kinds of people to have in politics, because every week you're going and you're hearing about the transcendent. You're hearing about a kingdom that's not of this world. And then you go back into politics, and it sort of tames your passions. It makes you realistic about what you can accomplish. I think it sort of sands away some of the utopian visions that you might have, or the triumphalist visions, and realize, okay, there's a lot of good work we can do, but this is not the ultimate thing, right? And I think if you take those people out of politics, what's left are people for whom policy and politics in every election is the ultimate thing, which is why I think you're seeing polarization. I think you see political violence, because that's the ultimate thing. But when in politics is not the ultimate thing, but it's a important thing ordered under your allegiance to Christ, it can become a very powerful and useful vehicle for human flourishing.
In your book, you note a difference in the treatment between people who profess to have a Christian faith who are on the left versus those who are conservative. And you talk about how, for example, Jimmy Carter, very famously was far more open about his faith than had been traditionally the case with people who were president in the past. And yet no one batted an eye, you note, because he was a Democrat. He was a liberal Democrat. How do you suppose that affects things? Where does that come from?
There is a tremendous double standard. It's interesting with Jimmy Carter. When he first came on the scene, there was actually some nervousness that who's this, Southern Baptist evangelical guy. And then obviously he became a pretty reliably left-leaning with his policies, and so then he was safe. It's nice that you teach Sunday school because you ratify all of our policies. But there's such a double standard. And I mentioned George Bush saying Jesus Christ is his favorite philosopher, people freaking out, or Mike Johnson when he quotes a few Bible verses, he's suddenly this white Christian nationalist. At the same time, you see on the left, a couple years ago on Easter Sunday, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer was in a pulpit, and he compared the appointment of Justice Jackson to the resurrection of Christ. And nobody howled about, this is nationalism, this is theocracy.
Well, Schumer also puts cheese on raw hamburger patties.
Yes,
so,
for that he should be impeached. I think, and I can find so many examples like that. And in fact, I talk to journalists all the time that cover this, and the narrative is that conservative Christians every week are going to church, and it's all politics all the time. We're handing out RNC talking points and Ronald Reagan bobbleheads, and bowing before a statue of Anne Rind or something like that. And the truth is, it's not even close. Most conservative Christian churches, when you go, are very pious, and there's very little mention of politics. They may talk about a particular issue. Maybe they have a Sanctity of Life Sunday, or they talk about the definition of marriage and things like that. Or they may tell you a couple weeks before the election to go vote. But there's very little politics. There's some outliers, right? There's some of our churches that lead into it more. On the left, if you go to church, you're much more likely to find politics in the pulpit. I would, as an experiment, visit a conservative evangelical church within 10 miles here. Just randomly pick one on a Sunday and go to church. You won't hear, I guarantee you won't hear much about politics. But if you do that with a progressive church, you're much more likely to. And I think it's a double standard because, obviously the media probably agrees more with the politics of the left. And I think we shouldn't fear it. I think people of faith have always been involved in public policy in this country, going back to the founding. I think I talk a lot about this in the book. Our leaders, well into the 20th century, talked about the importance of Christianity to the country, to this American experiment. Leaders on both sides. You can read FDR's D-Day prayer. You should read it. It's a beautiful prayer where he's pleading and asking God for victory in World War II. If a leader did that today, the media would absolutely lose their minds, right? Harry Truman, when he was dedicating a church in D.C. in 1975, Presbyterian Church, he basically said, this experiment in human liberty will not endure if we don't have virtue and religion, right? Dwight Eisenhower saw the importance of having under God on in the pledge and on the coins, And you go all the way back to the founders. Even our most secular founder, Thomas Jefferson, talked often about God's judgment on the nation, and often talked about how you need the importance of virtue and religion and Christianity in the country, the sort of thick layer of that, in order for this to work. So, I think in the last 50 to 60 years, this sort of secularism has really conditioned people to be alarmed when they hear these things, Christians sort of engaged in this way.
You talk about Jefferson and his warning or his concern for America, if God is just. Could you speak a little bit to some of the critiques that you hear from the left about the imperfections of America because of our sins, and how does that, how do you deal with that in your book when it comes to, for example, the fight both before the Civil War and during the Civil War, where there were believers on both sides, not only of this conflict, but over the question of slavery itself. And how do you address then in your book, for example, the criticism from the left aimed at both America and Christianity for things like slavery and Jim Crow?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a whole chapter in my book about how to think about history, American history, because that's one of the big objections, even when I would post about my book coming out, and patriotism. Immediately, it's like, oh, are you saying that we whitewash all of the sins of our past? Are you saying these kinds of things? And I really think there's two wrong ways to look at history. One is to whitewash our sins and pretend they didn't happen. Slavery and segregation and internment of Japanese people and other things, and treatment of Native Americans. Treat that like it didn't happen. Sort of hagiography. I think it's a wrong way to look at history. But also the equally wrong way, and I think this is more predominant today, is to act like that's the only story. That's the only history. So projects like the 1619 Project, Howard Zinn's view of history, to look at America only through the lens of injustice, like that's the only dominant narrative, that the nation was founded specifically for these purposes and these reasons. And I don't think that's true. I think it's inarguable that we have sins and injustices in our past that we should lament. We can't, whitewash those. But we also have tremendous story of overcoming those. And when you talk about Christianity, before I get to the Christianity part, every nation in human history has those parts of their past, some more than others, right? Because you're talking about the story of fallen. As a Christian, we believe that humanity's fallen. You're talking about fallen sinners. Even the best project, like I would argue America is one of the best experiments in human government, is drafted and built and run by sinners who will sin. So every nation has that. We're not unique that we have sins in our past. I would argue what's unique about America is that we've actually overcome some of these things because of our ideals, because of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Those words that Jefferson wrote, he didn't even understand the power and weight of those words. And I actually think if you care about injustice, as you should, the best way to defeat that is to actually appeal to our founding ideals, not throw them out altogether or consider them fraudulent. I don't think cynicism or nihilism is a great motivator for justice. And if you look at the great social reformers in America, Frederick Douglass, if you read his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," Douglass revered the founders. He loved their project. He said they were wise men. What he said was, we're not living up to this promise. So he had something to call Americans up to. Lincoln appropriated that, right? He said, we said all men are created equal. He says this in the Gettysburg Address. We're not living up to that. Martin Luther King did the same thing, right? But if you have a starting point that everything's terrible, nothing's good, nothing's redeemable, you actually have no motivation, no North Star for justice. When it comes to Christians' involvement in that, yeah, Christians were on both sides of the Civil War. Christians misapplied and misappropriated Scripture to justify slavery. That's shameful. You can't spin that any other way. I would also say that Christianity was at the heart of abolitionism. Christianity had within it the resources for abolitionism. And if you look at abolitionist movements around the globe throughout history, they had Christianity as their root, right? You think of William Wilberforce dedicating his whole life to abolishing the slave trade. And I don't want to be flippant about this. I mean, I think slavery and segregation were moral evils. But the surprising thing about America is not that we engaged in slavery, because nations were doing that for centuries. That doesn't make it any right or good. It's still an abomination. But the surprising thing is that we actually abolished slavery and overcame that. And so I think that's sort of the way to look at our history.
You talk about the challenge of partisanship or factionalism, which of course the founders were concerned about and drafted the Constitution to try to overcome some of that natural tribalism that humans engage in. Given that today, if you go back, let's say 60 years, there was no meaningful difference in regular attendance of church or synagogue between the two major parties, right? You could largely tell what someone was by what flavor, right? What denomination they were. That probably was the number one way you could tell if they were Republican or Democrat. But now you find just a gulf between the two major parties insofar as their faith. How does that affect partisanship? How does that affect compromise when when the opposing party doesn't necessarily share large portions of your worldview?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, to start at the beginning, partisanship and polarization is a problem, right? I think James Mattis has said that's the thing that he worries about most in terms of threat to the republic. And yet, when you look through history, America's politics have always been kind of rough and tumble, right? I mean, if you read about some of the elections, like Jefferson and Adams, for instance, and others, they were pretty tough. I think today, social media and other forms of sort of mediated communication and algorithms and all that stuff has contributed to being worse, so that we live in these silos of belief. But I do think the drop in church attendance is a huge factor. As I said, I think people who are regularly attending church, or I'm a Christian, I'm a Baptist, so I'm going to want people to go to church. But people who are religious and attending religious services, we can broaden it out there, weekly, are the kind of people you want in politics, because, again, there's a sense of the transcendent. They realize there's something more to life than what's in front of us. It tempers our politics for the most part, and gives us a sense of reality. When you lose that, I think politics becomes ultimate. And even folks who are not Christians are starting to say this, right? There was a great essay in The Atlantic a couple years ago by Derek Thompson, who's a skeptic or atheist, I think. And he said he used to cheer the decline of church attendance, to say, see, look how pluralistic we are. We even have, atheism on the rise, and isn't that great? He says he's actually flipped that, and he said, I see what it's done to our politics. I see what it's done to our people. So even though I don't go to church, I want everyone else to go back to church, right? Richard Dawkins recently said, Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist who's been, refuting Christianity, or trying to for several decades, said, all things being equal, he'd like to live in a Christian country, because it's the only kind of country that sort of protects the values that he cares about. So I think it's having a huge impact. And you mentioned the golf. It used to be both parties went to church, and really, increasingly, Democrats don't go to church. I'm not saying as a pejorative. It's just true, empirically true. And I think that is having an impact, right? Because when you lose that, politics becomes ultimate and important. I think that's why we're seeing political violence and all these kinds of things. I'm also a little bit nervous that church attendance is declining on the right, particularly among the working class. If you look at some of the numbers, at least it was for many years. I think it actually is ticking back up in the last couple of years, which is a good sign. People are starting to come back to church. Ross Douthat, the New York Times columnist, famously said a few years ago, if you don't like the religious right, you'll really not like the non-religious right. And I think we're seeing some of their influence, and it's not pretty. So it's really important to the American experiment. You know, when Alexis de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, what he observed here was America had what he called the two spirits, the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty, and how these things sort of worked side by side in a unique way in America, that it wasn't a sort of a top-down state church, but it was a religion that was community-based. You had these mediating institutions that really held the country together. G.K. Chesterton said that America had the soul of a church, that there was this sort of unique kind of religion and Christianity here. I think that's very important to this American experiment. And our founders understood this. You know, the founders did not want a state church. They did not want an established church. They had seen how that worked through years of church history and world history, right? That whenever you give the state the power to decide between right and wrong worship, it's not good for the church or the state. Inevitably, one tradition of Christianity is using it as against the other. They did not want that, right? And they were working through that. They didn't want a government that could prey on the conscience and force belief. At the same time, they never envisioned secularism. They understood that this experiment in ordered liberty will not work without a thick layer of virtue and religion and Christianity. I mean, John Adams famously said that this idea was only made for a moral and religious people. Jefferson even echoed similar themes. Washington did. Well, through much of our history, our leaders would say, appeal to America's uniquely Christian character. So I think those things are essential for the country. They're essential for this, and I think we should hope for sort of religious revival, religious awakenings, because I think that informs sort of the ideas and the mores and the values of the people who are having an influence, making our laws and all these kinds of things.
You write about two different versions of American exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. One that you say is based in a proper biblical understanding, mm-hmm. and the other that is twisted. Yeah. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'm borrowing here from John Wilsey's great book that was written about 10, 15 years ago on American exceptionalism. I don't always agree. He's a dear friend, but I don't always agree exactly where he draws the lines. I'm a little bit more accepting of some of the forms that he would consider improper. But I think that grid works, that taxonomy works. I think there's a closed kind of American exceptionalism, which says that, well, first of all, let me back up and say it's natural and normal for you to believe that your home and your place is the best, right? Chesterton talked about this. He said, well, of course you're going to think the place where you live that's close to you is the best. We all think this way, right? I married a Texan almost 23 years ago, and we were dating, and we lived in the Chicago area. She kept talking about Texas, and I'm like, okay, that's cool. You like your state. I'm from Illinois. I like my state, you know. She's like, no, you don't understand it. You don't get it. You know, Texans don't understand why you'd live anywhere else, right? They think this is the best place on earth. That's a natural affection, right? Or maybe you think of your alma mater, right? How many of you are Aggies here? Any Aggies? I shouldn't have asked that in Austin, right? One back there, brave soul. I'm not an Aggie, but I have Aggie friends, and you know it's a cult, right? The Aggie cult. They think their school is the greatest, and why would you go anywhere else? This is a natural affection. Well, theirs is a little bit unnatural, but it's a natural affection. So that's normal. I think there's two ways to have American exceptionalism. One is a closed American exceptionalism, which says our nation is the greatest nation in the history of the world, therefore it gives us the right to do whatever we want, We can conquer lands, manifest destiny. We're not accountable to anybody. We can do whatever we want. I think that's an improper way of thinking about it.
You also write, though, that
But there's a proper way of thinking
it's about Americans are better than other people, too, though.
Right, yeah, and thinking, there's an improper way of thinking about American exceptionalism. Part of that closed exceptionalism is thinking, we're the best country, we can do whatever we want, and we are superior humans to other people, right? And as a Christian, you can't believe that, right? You have to believe that every human is made in the image of God and has value and dignity and worth. When you think about the kingdom of God at the end of the age in Revelation, every nation, tribe is gathered around the throne of God, right? So you can't believe that you're morally superior to other people, individually, Americans. But then I think there's an open kind of exceptionalism which says, yes, this is the greatest experiment in human government. I love my country above other countries, but that makes me generous and grateful and humble. Right? To whom much is given, much is required. That because I've been blessed by God, I need to be open-handed. And I really think the founders understood this. If you read their prayers and if you read their speeches, God has blessed us by allowing us to prevail over the British and giving us this opportunity. Let's steward this well. Let's use this. Let's be generous. Let's be open-handed. I think that is a better way of thinking about it. And then I think objectively you can look at several metrics and say this is a miracle, right? Like, David McCullough, great historian who passed away a couple years ago, one of my favorites. I mean, he wrote and said that this kind of idea of the consent of the governed has never been tried before. This is a new thing in the world. And many others have said that. And I think you can objectively say, despite all of our flaws and problems, which are manifold, that this is the greatest country on earth. I think that's perfectly legitimate for a Christian to believe if you have a generous spirit and you understand that that should drive us to gratitude and humility and wanting to renew the nation for the next generation.
In the second half of your book, you talk about, you kind of move into the personal, and you talk about family, you talk about church, you talk about local, you talk about education. Enlighten us as to what are you trying to do with that second half of your book? I'm thinking that it has to do with a proper understanding of Christian citizenship. So could you lay that out for us?
Yeah, I mean, in the first half, I wanted to just make the case that it's good and right to be patriotic, right? That, as a Christian, Jeremiah 29 says to seek the welfare of your of your city, pray for its welfare, pray for its flourishing. I don't know how you seek the flourishing of a country that you hate or loathe. So having established those things, I think in the back half, it's like, okay, now we love our country. We want to be involved. What does it look like to roll up our sleeves and renew this nation for the next 250 years so that it survives for that? And really start with, the family and then the church and education, I think is really important, community. All those things really matter. So my goal in this book is, what I want to tell people is, okay, you love the country, you want to get involved. Getting involved doesn't mean, okay, now everyone be mad on Facebook and Twitter at the same time every 4 years. I mean, elections matter and voting matters, all that kind of stuff. But what can we do to renew the country in our communities where we have influence, and what are the major things? And I really think the family is a basic building block of society, and let's create policies that help people have rich and vibrant and healthy families. I think, the church is the social institution, in my view, that God has established to do his best work. I think churches are uniquely positioned to do this kind of work. And then obviously education, right? George Washington, in his first inaugural address, was really concerned about education. He felt like an educated citizenry was really important. And then
why was that? What did he say?
Well, it's just he felt like a well-informed citizenry was important because these are the people that are voting for leaders, and if we're the consent of the governed need to need to have education. And then his last inaugural address, 8 years later, he addressed it again. His idea was of this national college that he wanted to establish, which never happened. But I really think that's important. I think bad policies happen because citizens are not well informed. So I think education matters. And as Texas Public Policy Foundation has done so well, has illustrated that, there's a lot of parts of our educational system that have really gotten taken over by Marxism and all these kinds of ideologies, and is in desperate need of renewal. And I think, that work is really important for the future of the country. And then I encourage at the end localism, getting involved in your communities. Some people are called to more national type work, but for most for most people, it's what can I do in my local communities to help my communities flourish. And Tocqueville understood that the strength of America was that it was just a collection of really vibrant, interconnected communities.
What do you say to the young American who more or less has things together, right? They have a good job. Mm-hmm. Maybe they've recently gotten married, or perhaps they have an established family. Their bank account is in order, right? They don't have any major, psychological weaknesses that we know of. Mm-hmm. And yet they look at politics and they're just repelled by what they see as this lust for power, where mm-hmm. people will lie and do anything to gain power. And they say, I'm not of this world, right? I'm a Christian. Mm-hmm. I don't want to participate in that. You talk a bit about the obligations of being a Christian patriot in the arena. Can you explain or encourage people as to what they ought to do rather than what often just happens?
Absolutely. Now, I want to have an important caveat that everyone has different callings, right? So you have to do what pertains to your calling. But I do think at some level, every Christian should be involved in helping to shape the policies that affect the flourishing of the country. We've been given a unique stewardship, one that most people in human history have not had, that we have a voice and we have a vote. We may wish more people shared our opinions and policies went more our way, but we have a voice, we have a vote, we have an opportunity to shape the policies that affect our nation. And I don't know how we can obey Jesus' command to love our neighbor as ourselves if I have an opportunity to shape the policies that affect my neighbor's flourishing and I don't do anything. Or how can I say that I'm properly seeking the welfare of my city or my country, but I'm not engaged in shaping those things? And again, it depends on your calling, but I think at the basic level, everyone should be involved at some level. And when good people who do believe that that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, when good people like that withdraw, what fills that vacuum are people who don't have those beliefs. Someone is going to shape the laws. Someone is going to run for office. Someone is going to be in these positions. And I think it's better if people who have a well-formed sense of themselves and have a strong relationship with God and understand these realities are in those places, because what fills that is worse. And I actually do think that if you are in this kind of work, I talk about this a lot. I was just in D.C. talking to some Hill staffers, Senate and House, and emphasizing that, the spiritual disciplines do matter for politics, right? That your personal spiritual disciplines are essential for this kind of work. And if it's when people neglect those, that they do sort of give in to the lust for power, and they do give in to some of these things. One thing to think about with power, there is a kind of lust for power in politics. It can be intoxicating. Chuck Colson talked about that when he was in the Nixon White House, and how people would be awed by the Oval Office, and they would drop all their sort of objections. And it's very real. However, the problem isn't power. The problem is how we steward power. Someone will have power. So do we want good people with good character in those positions who steward it well on behalf of the people, right? the idea that you can just withdraw and it'll go away is just not true.
You talk about the lost tradition of patriotism. How is it lost?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at surveys, Pew Research does a survey on this every year. Less and less people are patriotic. I mean, patriotism has dropped significantly in the last several decades. I think there's a few reasons for that. I think one, there has been this push by the left and media to sort of shame people out of being patriotic, that it's cringy or it's, jingoistic or it's dangerous, right? I don't like the fact that love of the flag has been coded one side of the aisle or the other. I don't think that's healthy. So there has been this push to push it out of the public, push people from being patriotic. But I also think, there's a lot of cynicism and about the failure of institutions. I think trust in institutions right now is at an all-time low. And a lot of it for good reasons. Our institutions have failed us at every level, right? Business and government and the church even, right? And so people are just looking around and saying, can I trust anything? Is anything real? And I would just say the criticism of these institutions is absolutely right. The answer is not, again, cynicism or nihilism or just let's burn it all down. But let's roll up our sleeves and reform our key institutions. Let's start new ones. Let's make it better for the next generation. I think of the founding generation. They were in their 20s and 30s, right? These men had other things they could be doing. They were farmers. I was just at Mount Vernon with my son, and Washington, all he wanted to do is go back to his farm. It's like, can y'all leave me alone? He kept getting pulled back into this, right? But these were young men, young women, young people involved. And, they set about building a nation. It was hard work, but they rolled up their sleeves and did it. I think it's incumbent on us to say, what are we going to leave for the future generations? Will we leave them a country as good as the one that we had? Will we have gratitude for the things that we've inherited that are good? Yes, there's a lot of problems in America, but there's a lot of good. There's a lot of really good things. What's interesting to me, I have a lot at Southwestern where I teach. We have a lot of children of immigrants who are enrolled. And on Election Day last year for the class, we just sat around and said, what are you guys thinking about the election? Who are you going to vote for? I didn't know. I mean, I kind of had an idea, but they all overwhelmingly, we're going to vote Republican. And I said, why? They said, well, we love this country. But what they talked about was so fascinating. Their parents who are immigrants, they said they're the most patriotic people they know. They love this country. I mean, Lee Greenwood on all day and flags in front of their house. Why? Because they've seen the contrast from the totalitarian regimes they left to come to this country. So this is still a good country. People are dying to get into this country. We have to put up walls and have all this technology and have a whole, ICE, all these people to keep people out of this country, right? People aren't doing that to some of these other places, right? I hear people say, oh yeah, Cuba has great health care. Really? Are people dying to get into Cuba to experience their health care? I don't think so, right? So I think those of us who've been here, if this is all you know, all you see are the issues and problems. But if you see the contrast, man, you're grateful for the country.
All right, now it's time for questions and answers. So we do have a mic that's going around. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, and the mic will come to you. And tell us your name, if you're with an organization, which organization that is, and make sure to end your statement with a question mark, because it's a question, not a statement. Thank you. Please.
Hello, my name's Andre Burnell. You've spoken about Christianity and secularism, but not about other religions.
Yeah.
And so my question is there something unique about the American experiment that requires the religion to be Christianity, or could other religions that, say, for example, believe in the caste system or believe in fundamentally treating women as second or third class citizens, could those religions also be part of a successful, patriotic American experiment?
That's a great question. if you read the founders and the folks who were drafting the Constitution, they really were wrestling with, and really even go back to the state constitutions and establishment, really wrestling with this question, right? Some of the early states had establishment, like you had to be a Christian to hold office, you had to be a certain kind of Christian, right? And then sort of, my forefathers, the Baptists, really fought against that, right? The Baptists didn't want to be licensed to preach, they didn't want the state involved in their work, so they, Roger Williams fled and went to Rhode Island. They really wrestled with this because they understood the importance of Christianity. They understood the importance of that, and yet they didn't want the government to imperil the conscience, to force people to believe, right? And so it was a real delicate balancing act. One of the first moves in the early, even before the drafting of the Constitution, some of the state constitutions, but then as you get into drafting the Constitution, was a question of Jewish people, right? So some of the statements said, we don't want to imperil the conscience. Anybody who acknowledges God as Lord and Christ as Savior can serve. Well, then the Jewish populations would write and say, well, that kind of excludes us. And so then you have them, George Washington writing back and others saying, you know what, you're right, let's expand this to a more sort of generic theism. And then, I think expanding outward from there, and they had different views on this. I think there's a couple things to think about. One, one of the things that is important for America is when people come here, they assimilate, right, to our way of life. And we want freedom. I think we want freedom of religion, freedom of worship. We don't want the government empowered to say, that's the wrong form of worship. You must believe something differently. That I think the founders were nervous about. That's something I'm nervous about. At the same time, there are limits to religious liberty. I think the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was signed in a bipartisan way in the 90s, which is so interesting, pretty much has it right. I think when it says that the government can't imperil religious liberty unless there's a compelling state interest, and it has to do it in the least burdensome means. So sometimes the religions, the state has to say, no, you can't do that, right? So for instance, there's a form of Hinduism that an ancient form of Hinduism that I don't think is practiced much today, where if a man died, his widow would be burned on a funeral pyre, right? And one of our Baptist missionaries went to India and sort of eradicated that practice. Well, you couldn't do that in America. The state would say, you can't burn a widow on a funeral pyre, right? Or there's some religions where, they refuse medical treatment for the children, like, important life-saving treatment. So there are places where the state has to say, no, that's too far, right? So I think that there's that delicate balance there, right? So there are some practices of some religions that would not be constitutional, right? I don't know how deep in the weeds we want to get here. The Church of Latter-day Saints, for instance, came here to America, they established in America. They condone the practice of polygamy, but then they changed, right? And they accommodated. And, I think that's an interesting model. I would say this. I think America is I don't like saying America's a Christian nation, although many of our leaders use that language throughout our history, so it's not, even Martin Luther King and others use that too. But I would say, but I don't like that construction, but I would say America is very influenced by Christianity. The founders were steeped in even the secular founders like Jefferson and Franklin, who are more Unitarian than what we consider an Orthodox Christian. They were raised by Christians. They were in the milieu of Christianity. That's what they thought about. But I think Christianity helps democracy. But the founders understood you have to have virtue, you have to have religion, and arguably they wanted kind of a thick layer of Christianity. For me, I would like America to become more Christian, but the way that I think about that is that has to come from the bottom up, where people are genuinely turning to faith, and not from the government forcing that. But there are questions like that about assimilation, right? And how do we solve those questions, right? There's certain things some religions practice that, if you live here, you can't practice those things. You can't practice that way. But it's a very delicate dance. It's a great question.
All right, now everyone is going to be intimidated because all subsequent questions are going to be measured by the yardstick
Yes.
of the last question. So make sure that you think for a little bit before you ask.
Thank you. Michael DeSciullo, just contributing member here at TPPF. It actually kind of flows from what you were just saying. Our constitutional system and a lot of our concept of rights and the law are from that framework of, you could say, Christianity, Abrahamic religion, but it's not, it's almost baked in, right? Like it's like fish in water. What does water mean to a fish, right? That link, I feel like, has been obscured for a lot of people in the last couple of generations, and I think a lot of that is due to poor civics education. How do we re-emphasize that link in, let's say, public, primary schooling, without veering into a part where we're getting into the religious liberty is actually is affected, or we're pushing a certain Christian party line, but to let young people know that that is part of who we are and what we do?
That's a great question. I think, first of all, we have to teach civics at all levels and teach it more. And I actually like what Texas is trying to do with some of the new curriculums that are optional. I've read some of them. Despite what you read, it's not this theocracy or whatever. It's just really good civics.
Wait a minute. The media didn't quite get it
yeah,
right?
Shocker.
Okay. Wow.
But the interesting thing is, America has Judeo-Christian roots. What's interesting, if you study history, the countries that have been the most free for people of all faiths, who have burdened the conscience the least, who have the most robust religious liberty, are nations that have Judeo-Christian roots, right? I mean, because I think, at the heart of Christianity and Judaism is this idea of the Imago Dei, that humans are made in the image of God. They're given agency to choose to believe. That to force someone to believe is a violation of their conscience, and it's a diminishing of their humanity. Now we persuade and we make arguments, and so that's why I think religious freedom, and this is why the Declaration says that our rights are endowed to us by our Creator, right? That there's a nod there to the transcendent. That's also, that phrase is so important because it also is a sort of humble acknowledgement that government is not the one who dispenses rights. It's God who gives rights, and government is supposed to, protect them and adjudicate those. So I do think we need to teach people that the country has Judeo-Christian roots, and yet at the same time, people are free to believe and worship as they see fit. As a Christian, I think Christianity can compete in the marketplace of ideas. That we are not intimidated by the presence of other religions. We want to make our case. We want to persuade, evangelize, all those kinds of things. But we don't need the sword. We don't need the government to do our work for us, right? And so I think that's an important question, really. But it's civics. I think civics education is really important. There's a really poor misunderstanding of that. Hopefully, America 250 will revive some of that. I hope that people will start thinking through that. I think families should take their kids to go see these historical places. We're kind of history nerds in our family, so we've dragged our kids all over. And but I think it's really important for families to do, for schools to do, for churches to do, to educate folks that way.
We have a question over here.
My name is Dane, and you had spoken about the growing gulf in church attendance between Democrats and Republicans, but even within the Christian community, there seems to be a growing gulf between young men and young women, in that young men are going to the most trad church they can find, and young women seem to be going more towards Baptist and non-denominational churches. And aside from the theological differences, there are a lot of cultural differences between these two churches. So my question is, what do you think is driving this trend, and how do you see it impacting Christianity's influence on American culture and politics?
Yeah, I am nervous about the sort of gender divide on politics, and what you said. I don't really know how you fix it. I do think churches need to be accommodating to both, right? And I think it's part of the polarization that we're not mixing with people who might be a little different than us. I think going to church with people who might have a slightly different view of certain things than you do is helpful and healthy. I would encourage young men. I love that young men are returning to church, right? This is the first time in a long time where young men are returning to church. I think Charlie Kirk had a lot to do with that. What I love is he had all these people who flocked to him because of his political opinions, and once he got them there, he basically said, "Okay, guys, you need to become a Christian. You need to get married. All that." I love that. But I would say young men. I'm glad young men are going to church, but I do think, pursuing marriage is a good thing, and maybe what I would say to young men is maybe don't go to the most trad church you can think of. Maybe try to put yourself in a place where you can meet someone who you have shared values in that way. But it's part of that polarization that is, I think, not good. Marriage is good in the sense that there's a sort of in Christian terms we talk about sanctification, that it's sort of living with someone else in a covenant relationship. Sort of helps you become less selfish and less opinionated and more humble, and it sands off some of the rough edges that you have, and vice versa, right? So I would say don't just seek out young people, don't just seek out people who think exactly like you do on every single narrow thing, right? If you agree on the big things, maybe seek someone out who disagrees with you, and you might learn a thing or two. But that is a and I do think there's some truth to the criticism that maybe some Christian communities were more accommodating to women than men, so men felt uncomfortable there. Could be the same thing, vice versa, right? And some of these other communities where women felt uncomfortable. So I think we have to think through those things and try to have more diverse communities of faith in that way.
All right.
So you mentioned early on, first in the middle you treated, I think, like the kind of Christian Baptist nationalism really well. You mentioned kind of you didn't specifically mention like the Deneen integralism that's kind of infected the Catholics. And then as you were answering some of the earlier questions, you talked about our Christian heritage as a nation, which in some cases in the founding actually intentionally excluded Catholics because they kind of set apart and they've done their own share of problems. But I just wanted to see if you had kind of a more like in-depth treatment of the integralism that's not just like take over the government and force everyone to be Catholic, but also somehow tries to twist in the Benedict option where it's like take over the government, force everyone to be Catholic, and also burn down the cities and go back into the countryside.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of that last part. I think it's an interesting conversation we're having. The founding generation was scarred by centuries of religious wars. So they were very nervous about the government with the power to burden the conscience, right? They just did not want a state church for that reason. I think we should keep that in our minds and not be so ignorant of history to know that what they feared was real and those arrangements don't work well. We are coming to this argument after a couple centuries of modernity, and we're scarred by modernity, and we've seen the negative impact of secularism and progressivism, and we're wondering, maybe we need a little bit more Christianity in our public life, right? So I think that's why we're having these conflicts. I disagree with the Catholic integralists on, I think the end goal of what they want, but I do think some of them are right in their critiques of secularism and saying we need more of this sort of Christianity in our public life. So I don't want to dismiss it outright, because they are hitting on something. It should make those of us who care deeply about classical liberalism and religious liberty to lean in more to the sort of Christian foundings of the country. Here's an example. 10 years ago, I would have said, cultural Christianity is going away. And that's a good thing, because now you'll just have the true believers, and true believers will really stick out. And I've actually changed my mind on that. I actually think cultural Christianity was good for the country. It wasn't salvific. It wouldn't get you to heaven, right? You still need churches to say you must be born again. You still need churches to bring people to a more serious faith. But cultural Christianity was good for our communities, right? That everyone had somewhat of a shared framework. Because what replaces it is worse, right? And so I am less allergic to forms of cultural Christianity than I used to be, right? I think it's sort of a baseline that sort of holds the country together. But I don't agree with Deneen and some of the integralists, but I do think some of the points they make about the loss of some of that is helpful. I don't agree, as I said before, I don't think a state church is a good idea. I don't think the government, and there's various shades of this, right? Stephen Wolfe's project is pretty intense in terms of, the Constitution's not helpful, let's get rid of that, let's have a Protestant state. He doesn't have a lot for religious liberty in there, and that makes me nervous, especially as a Baptist who, Baptists got drowned by the other religions, and we don't want to go back to that.
You want to put that to a poll?
Right, yes.
Yeah.
But then there's shades of it, right? Like Doug Wilson is not quite where Stephen Wolfe is. He loves the Constitution, but he thinks everyone should be a religious test. I don't think that's good either. The Catholic integralists have different shades of that. So I don't want to. I disagree with that, because I don't think it's a right way to do things. I think you can ground religious liberty in Scripture, right? When Paul tells Timothy to pray in 1 Timothy 2, he says, pray for leaders. Why does he ask him to pray for leaders? So that we can live a quiet and peaceable life. Why? So that we can advance the gospel, because there's one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. What Paul is saying is he's saying there should be space between the church and the state, that the state should let the church do its thing. Paul could only pray for it, right? He was in Rome under Nero. He would not have voted for Nero, right? But I think that's a good formulation. Plus, so that's one reason I don't agree with those prescriptions. The other reason, I just think it's never going to happen, right? We can barely pass a pro-life referendum in Kentucky. We're not going to get our fellow citizens to vote for a, Presbyterian or Baptist or Catholic state anytime soon, right? And one more thing, when you see the state church on offer around the world, it's not that great, right? I mean, in Finland, they have a state church, and they're arresting this politician for the wrong kind of political expressions. In the UK, they have a state church, and they're about to enshrine gay marriage. In Russia, they have a state church. Putin is aligned with the Russian Orthodox Church. What do? They throw Catholics and evangelicals and Baptists in jail, right? So, it's, this idea that, well, this one time it will work, even though every other time it hasn't, I just don't believe. That being said, I think we should lean into the Christian roots of them, the Judeo-Christian roots in America. I think this kind of cultural Christianity was helpful and good. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time together this afternoon. Daniel Darling will be out there with his book that he would be delighted to sign and sell to you. I'm presuming you're going to sign them.
Yes, I would love to sign
that's
your
good.
book.
That's great. And thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.